so one of the main thing that Zinzendorf is responding to intellectually is the issue is the rise or the incoming of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was a philosophical movement. It was basically this turn towards reason. It's also, some people have even called it the age of reason. And this at this point, this is the place where reason takes on a predominant role. It takes on, reason becomes the way to which anything is known, reason and the five senses. So this is when you get, extreme scientific advancement, right? There's a lot of movement in the sciences. There's a lot of advancement in mathematics, how we understand the world, what we know about the world. And this age of enlightenment found its way into theology as well, because what used to be, going back to Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, who saw reason as one of the primary ways that we know God to exist. Now reason is being used to say, well, God doesn't exist, or God doesn't need to exist, because we, in the same way as before, it leads to sort of a lot of maybe some like forms of deism, which is basically, God is this, he sort of built this thing and then let it go, and we're on our own to figure it out now. But there was a builder, but he's not in the world and integrated into what's going on now. And the Enlightenment sort of presented these challenges to faith and reason, and the relationship between faith and reason. And Zinzendorf sees that this struck, and he was also a student of the Enlightenment, was very read on major Enlightenment thinkers. This was not something that would have been foreign to him. But this was something that Zinzendorf was very interested in reconciling together. That he was interested in seeing the ways that the challenges the Enlightenment faced needed, like, faith also needed to confront those and to innovate. It needed to think through the ways that faith can reshape and reform itself so that it can be resonant with people. And that's and for Zinzendorf, he didn't want to abandon faith or reason. He didn't want to say, turn just to emotionalism, which was one response to the Enlightenment. It's just, well, we won't think about God, we'll just feel God, and feeling is the only way that we can get to know God. But Zinzendorf is really trying to bring the full human experience, not to discount the Enlightenment for what it brought, but also not to discount sort of faith as well. And so that really brings me around to sort of the topic of the third video, or the third point for this evening, and then we'll kind of move into some discussion, which is looking at an introduction to Zinzendorf's blood and wounds theology, which, in my argument, what I would argue is that this is the place, and these are the things at which Zinzendorf is the most, where he becomes the most innovative. And you can see some of this, this same, the blood and the wounds theology is seen in a lot of different ways throughout Moravian history. There's been a lot of different perspectives on it throughout different stages of history, and looking at how important was it to Moravians, how much of it carries on, should be carried on, and all of those kind of things. But what I find interesting is even still, even though it was sort of at one point de-emphasized in our history, which we'll talk about next week, that we still find remnants of it. We still see it, our Savior's blood and righteousness is one of our hymns. We see it in our liturgies. By your, in the one liturgy towards the end of it, there's a lot of, you see this same language still being carried over in our church today. So even though it may not be something we have explicitly talked about throughout our history, it is something that has been a through line through Moravian polity and worship, that's still with us today. And the main the main thing that I think, to boil down sort of what the wounds theology meant for Zinzendorf, was it was a way the wounds told us who Jesus is. The wounds tell us who Jesus is. And what they tell us is that Jesus is wounded in the way that we are wounded. That Jesus's experience of humanity was not one that only one part of him experienced the sufferings, but that it was the totality of Christ that experienced these sufferings, and that these sufferings weren't just nail marks in the wrist and a spear wound in the side. But what Zinzendorf is getting at is that this woundedness is more primary to human existence. Like there's something foundational to this, because in the like the litany of the wounds, when in some of the liturgical references to this work, they speak of Jesus' wounds in very contemporary ways. They talk about Jesus identifying with the wounds of Jesus that weren't actually, we had no record of those wounds, but they're connecting it to their current experience of woundedness in their lives. And this, I think, is why this is sort of, I think, the fundamental truth that Zinzendorf's wounds theology gets at about Christ, is that it's emphasizing that Christ is wounded in the same way that we are, that we come to life. There are the sort of wounding things that happen to us, the bad, experiences, and we all have different ones of those, right? We all come to life with a different set of experiences, and some experience more difficult things than others. But there's also something about a primary disconnect that we all experience, that's universal to all of us, regardless of what happened, what your past was, or what your immediate experiences were. And this, I think, is the important thing that why I think this wounds theology is so important today. So I need some more water. I'm getting too excited and talking too fast now. So one of the reasons why this is so important today is because I think if you look across the world, if you look across society right now, I think a lot of people can identify with a fundamental woundedness to existence. And this isn't meant to be like depressive or to sort of like be like a pessimist or anything. But really it's acknowledging something true about being human and giving us the hope for how do we move forward with it, giving us the hope of how do we carry with these wounds, how do we walk with them in a way that doesn't that we're not hiding from them, but we're finding strength in them. Because this is where we see some of the primary parables of Jesus, right? That strength is found in weakness. Like that's the great reversal of the kingdom of God according to Jesus, is that it's not the strong who prosper, it's the weak. And we know, and Zinzendorf picked up on the weakness of Christ in these wounds, and that is the place of strength. And so you get this imagery of Jesus, like of sort of like living in the side wound, the sort of like why, and it can get a little bit like weird for us to read today. But if you look at this poetic language, we see what Zinzendorf is getting at is that it's in that God, and God, creator of the universe, incarnate in the person of Christ, has come to experience it the same way we're not alone, right? We're not alone. We're not alone even like existentially, because like even God experiences this heartbreak, this wound, this trauma, and through that it allows us to then see another person for not maybe the way that they've acted, or the way that they've treated, or the way that they've hurt us, but to see them in the same way, to see them as wounded, And I want to read one quote. This is a quote of Zinzendorf. It's the one I read from the video as well. And this is from Craig Atwood's book, Community of the Cross, on page 107. And again, this is Zinzendorf. He says, when we thus lay ourselves in the heart of the Savior, we lay ourselves at the same time in his wounded heart, the one in order to be rightly loved by him, the other in order to be made sound. And I think that exemplifies really, really well what Zinzendorf is getting at. Because when we give ourselves to, like, when we lay ourselves in, give ourselves to Christ, when we turn over, relinquish us trying to control the way that we are in the world, we're laying ourselves in the heart of it's a wounded heart. And that's where the place of peace and transformation comes from, not from strength, but from weakness. And in that we are both loved and we are made whole, or made sound, as Zinzendorf said, which maybe I even like that a little bit better than made whole. But we see that this is not about running from the wounds, not from our own or from Christ, but from embracing them in a way that allows us to move forward, because we're not ignoring them, we're not covering over them, because so many times we try to cover over those things by ways of power or coercion. I need to be right, I have to be right, because if I'm not right, then I might have to expose myself to this wound that I don't want to deal with. But in Christ, what Zinzendorf tells us is it's okay. Like, it's okay. And the other important thing that I think for Zinzendorf in this wounds theology is that these don't go away after the resurrection. So, like, we know, like, and this is why I've come to call doubting Thomas the faithful now, because I think Thomas was right to demand to see the wounds of Christ, because without those wounds, it's not quite the Savior worth having, because in those eternal wounds of Christ that Thomas demanded to see, we know that what Jesus said came to be true, that his even in his resurrection, it wasn't a resurrection of strength and triumph, because those wounds carried with him, and those wounds carry with Christ in eternity. And I think that's something, it's even, to me, it even reflects more that by coming, like, we make peace with those wounds through the power of Christ, and that's where the healing happens. The healing happens because we're able to know that we are not left alone to deal with them, to process through them. So I went a little bit longer than I intended on this talky part. So we will, what I'll do now is turn it over to questions. And I don't know how the settings are. I think you can unmute yourself, but if you just want to unmute yourself, ask a question, and we can kind of go back and forth that way.
Hello, Don Frey. I enjoyed the videos, and are you hearing me? Yes. I enjoyed the videos, and you're recapping it this evening, and I really like what you've brought out in the blood and wounds theology, and it makes me think of the whole discussion that has gone on, off and on over many, many years about the nature of the atonement. Because viewed this way, it's really a whole new view, it's not some substitution for a penalty. It's not even a victory over Satan, but rather it's God truly affirming unity with humanity. In the supreme way.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think what Zinzendorf brings in his way of understanding the atonement doesn't fit neatly in a lot of a lot of those other boxes, and that it does it because it has elements of a little bit of all of them, but none of them really fully capture it as well. And yeah, I think that's yeah, I think that's a great observation. And I think that, and to me, like exploring that can maybe help us to find what might resonate about that message to people today. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, so Don, you mentioned how this sort of, Chaz, that doesn't quite fit with the incarnation, not the incarnation, the atonement that the theories that we've got working with that. And I've been thinking about that a lot too. I love Zinzendorf. I love his theology. It makes me joyous in a way that I cannot describe. And if you have any doubts, you can ask my mom about that. But for me, the woundedness of Christ and Zinzendorf's theology, if we think about the atonement as the reconciliation of God and humanity, the joining together of God and humanity, that reconciliation there, it confuses me that none of the ways we traditionally understand that are tied and based in the incarnation itself, that God became flesh, dwelt among us as Jesus. And so for me with Zinzendorf, what he does, I don't know if he ever talks about this, I haven't seen it in any of his sermons that I've read, but that the incarnation itself is the atonement. And that is demonstrated clearly, and that's a full atonement, a full incarnation, that God is fully human in the fact that God received these wounds in the person of Jesus. And how that just dramatically translates into our lives, that the fact that I know what it's like to stub my toe probably means that Jesus stubbed his toe, and God knows that exact pain, that frustration, and that, like, gotta catch what I'm about to say, depending on where I'm at. And just the relational piece of that. And that is a beautiful piece of theology and understanding, and it means a lot to me. And I would love to be able to explore that in a more deeper sense. Just the connection between the woundedness and the wounding, not as a punishment, but as a, look, guys, I'm fully human. I'm doing this because I love you. And this is God in the flesh as one of you because I love you.
Yeah, Aaron, I think you're right. I mean, I think one of the for me, I think that's, you see that come out for Zinzendorf in the way that the sort of the sort of things that are mentioned in the litany of the wounds, and that there is this almost, it's almost like there's this attempt to name every way in which we are hurt, not in a necessarily just in a physical way, but at a deeper level too. And there is this almost like this need to sort of like name, like put it into words, like what are those things, and when we name them, we can just say that those wounds are Jesus's wounds, or Christ's wounds too. And that practice, both, I think, is a helpful devotional practice for like helping us to live in the world, but it's also one that tells us a lot about what we think about who God is and who Christ is. which I think, shapes everything, because there's been different ways of understanding the work of Christ throughout church history and theology, and some of those ended up in better ways for people to live, and some didn't. We've had some pretty bad interpretations of the cross that have led to some pretty bad things happening in the world. And so we have to be really intentional about what we say about Jesus, what we say about the cross, what we believe about it, because it has real world effects. And I think what Zinzendorf picked up on was fundamentally both a humility and a strength at the same time, which played itself out in the way, obviously they weren't, the Moravians were not perfect by any means. I think, I think last week's, I think Frank Crouch has been doing some work on sort of, racism and slavery. And I think we need to contend with our history and even the not so helpful parts of it. But I do think what Zinzendorf discovered in the wounds theology was a way in which it allowed a type of expansion into the Indies through the Native Americans, like this way of doing mission work to where my job is to help you find the wounded Christ. Like that's it. That's all. I'm trying to help you to discover this wounded Savior, like I have discovered. And there's a humility in that doesn't, which is what makes it so different than a lot of other, particularly European styles of mission, which were very, coercive and not to say that we're even again, we need to be honest with our history, but it is important to point out the ways that that transformed how they, not just what they thought about Christ, but how they lived in the world, how they interacted with other people, how they organized their life. So yeah, and again, this will be a little bit more of what we'll talk about, I hope, next time. But I think you're right. This idea of the incarnation, it's real. Zinzendorf's trying to really go to the depths of that idea and put it into how does this affect who we are,
and just the radical transition or difference between Christians today and for a couple centuries have talked so much about, have you accepted Jesus into your heart? The language is Jesus moving into our heart. But Zinzendorf, in the quote that you read, was talking about, how do we go into the heart of Jesus? And I think that relationship, it's not Jesus that I possess, but it's the Jesus who possesses me. And how that frees us from having to control and be perfect as well. So I don't know if we're going into that next, but that's just the movement that we're going into the heart of Jesus is to me a much more helpful image for what discipleship looks like than the language we normally are used to hearing.
So I have a bit of a clarifying question, just to make sure I'm kind of grasping this. So really in just going back to Thomas and Thomas's wounds, and Thomas says, I won't believe unless I see the wounds. And Jesus, he says, come here, place your hand in my side. He shows him his wounds. And really just the picture of Christ's wounds being our wounds, and how we live a life of suffering, and Christ has eternally taken on and shared in our wounds through the cross. Is that kind of that's kind of what we're saying?
Yeah, that would be my yes, that would be how I sort of see Zinzendorf's wounds theology and how we might find ways to talk about it today. Yeah, I think that's spot on.
Awesome. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the passage in Hebrews, talking about it says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, and yet without sin. And just even in his sufferings, that he's even even in that way he's suffered with us.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a great passage to bring in. So yeah, I guess how does all of that resonate with you? Does that seem to ring true for you?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I believe it's, you know, the wounds theology. I love hearing about this. It's so cool. I think, you know, the wounds of Jesus and the message of the cross is just, it has to be the center point of our faith, you know? So I think I love like getting back to that and really just focusing on it. And even like in a more expansive way, rather than, you know, the cross is, you know, just for my sins. It's not only for my sins, it's for my relationship with Christ. It's comfort knowing that Christ in every way has gone through what I've gone through, and yet without sin.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, because I think part of what that, like, really meditating and living into that perspective, it ultimately will change how you see other people too, because you begin to see others the way that Christ does, you know, which is one that obviously we have to hold people accountable, and there's accountability is important, but it doesn't, nobody's off the hook, because we're all in this same woundedness together. Like, we're all like, it's the same, and it's not sort of like this beating up for all of these bad things that you've done in your life, but it's an acknowledgement of the struggle, of the difficulty, and that God is not foreign from that struggle and that difficulty, and actually God is so present in it that experienced it at the core, you know. So I think, you know, I think another way to describe Zinzendorf's theology is this sort of radical Christocentrism. You know, for him, like seeing everything through Christ, which that's not every theology is built that way. You know, like there are other theologies that emphasize different aspects, but I would say for Zinzendorf, it is a radical Christocentrism, that everything has to be seen through these wounds theologies, for better or for worse. And it does change how you understand other parts of your faith, but ultimately the drive is to change how you are in the world, which was huge for Zinzendorf, because he never wrote a systematic theology. He didn't write treatises in theology. He wrote hymns. He wrote some, but it was like, unless this is doing something in the world, like, it's not of particular interest, which I think is also really important for us to keep in mind today too. So thank you for that. That's really awesome.
Yeah, I love that. And, you know, I think that's what my generation even needs is just, they need that kind of view. And, you know, you're talking about the Enlightenment and how even it would correlate to now. Like, I think I see that. I think I really do see that, yeah, we need that view of the cross and that message.
Question. You started out by talking about the demise of the established church for the last 30 years and the statistics that go with that. How would you characterize how Christ is preached? Because Christ has been preached those 30 years. You know, I preach him and him crucified, his teachings, and perhaps not the specific of the wound, but I'm having a hard time thinking that it's our theology. I think our theology is not understood in general, what it means to have a personal relationship with Christ. I'm not sure that that's something that people understand, but I'm having a hard time figuring out what the church is doing wrong. You know, we're preaching Christ, we're preaching his teachings, we're saying you need a personal relationship, and yet people are walking out our doors. And how would teaching the woundedness of, you know, that we enter into Christ's wounds, I don't know. I think that if young people heard that today, they'd think that was nuts.
Yes, and it is. I mean, I think You're right. I mean, it sounds nuts when you read it, and it's like, it sounds even, it's, I think part of it is the truth that the wounds theology reveals, and how do we, and I think what you're picking up on is like a hugely important point, which is like the difference between like how do we, like, what we believe about our faith and then how we talk about it, because it's, and this is where this is a little bit of a tangent, but this is where I think one of the things I think this church has struggled with across like theological spectrums is that its reliance on its own language and its reliance on assuming that other people understand its language. And so I think one of the things that in talking about what needs, like looking towards the future, is basically like we're becoming like cultural translators, and it is a method of beginning to understand like what resonates with like what resonates with people, and how our faith and theology relate to that. And that's not like it's not an easy it's a messy process, because every culture is different. There are some things that are universally true about all of us, obviously, and that's why one of the great things I think about this wounds theology is it shows us something that is universally true, but how we talk about those come in so many different forms, and has to be really attuned to understanding sort of culture and context, and willing to sort of try and fail in that communication. Like, and that's one of the things I think the church has struggled with, is it hasn't given itself permission often to try and fail, and then try again in that communicating process, in that translating process. And that I don't know if that helps answer the question at all, but I would more hinge it on it is how we talk about these things. And this sort of conversation is really peeling even that back one layer and looking at the underneath parts of the wounds theology. But the next, sort of to move on from this would be how do we speak to a culture that doesn't even know, that may not even understand when we say Christ, right? Like, and so what does this look like? And that's almost like that's a whole nother Comenius Learning Series in and of itself in some ways. But I think it's a really great point and a really great question. Thank you.
Chaz, I wonder if I could give an example of how this teaching can come down to earth and be meaningful in a recent situation in life. Is that all right?
Yeah, that'd be great.
When I came here, my closest relative was a doctor whose his name was Hegi Kapp, and he was in charge of the TB sanitarium. He was a pulmonologist, a lung specialist. And when he heard that I had done graduate work in theology, he let me know that he thought theology was a lot of words. And I posed him the question, well, my father talked of Jello as a lot of nothing. Would that be a figure that would be suitable to him for theology? And he said, yes. Well, I came back to him about 4 years later when he knew he was dying of emphysema. And being a pneumatologist, he knew exactly the process that would result in his death. It would be slow asphyxiation. And he said that in reading Spangenberg's Ide Fide Fratrum about Jesus in Gethsemane, facing Jesus' suffering, had great meaning for him. Theology had suddenly come out of the woodwork into his life in the fellowship of Jesus' sufferings. And so I don't think we should get too overawed at our culture's lack of ready connection with this preaching or this gospel, this good news. We should find ways to let it be part of our lives, and maybe we can find ways to make connections that we will be led in ways that will open up possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that. Like, that's, I think, exactly right. And I love, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's a really beautiful story, and one I think is so in line with Zinzendorf's wounds theology, because, and I love the point you made about making it just like living living it in a way that allows people to contact the theology and the faith, that way. Because I think, one, I think that's what Zinzendorf did, and two, I think that transcends the cultural differences. You know, it's getting the point at which we find our commonality with one another is the point of our woundedness, and we know each other's, like, it's a commonality for us as humans, but it's also our connection point to God, and like it's a way to build, you know, it builds solidarity, and I think that's a great, I think that story is a great example of that. Thank you.
I've got to jump in here a little bit. These things bring back to memory. 50 years ago, there was a book, a self-help book about transactional analysis. I'm okay, you're okay. I don't know if anybody remembers this book, but it's a thing basically saying, I've been wounded, but you've been wounded, but we're okay with carrying the wounds around that we have. And so I think that, you know, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be part of this conversation or not today, but it seems as though the nature of our woundedness, whether we were born with the wounds that we have or whether we encountered these wounds and they're ours to live with the rest of our lives, the whole idea that they realize that Jesus Christ was also wounded, and he is at one with us, you know, in carrying these wounds around for the rest of my life, is a pretty important piece of living. It just you know, this conversation kind of brought me to this idea of having read this book 50 years ago, and so here we are talking about it here in 2021. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it just makes me want to explore that idea, even that idea a little bit more about what that looks like of finding our commonality in that aspect of life, in that wounded aspect of life. And not as and not looking at it as an easy answer or as some form of like hopelessness or any like negativity, but like actually turning it into a source of joy and hope and grace. But I do want to be, Aaron, I think you raised your hand, or someone told me that.
I did, but I've also talked a lot, so I did not know if I had time. I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you want to, we're getting close to wrapping things, so because I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. But so that I was basically I was making the call for, if you want to say anything, say it now. So if you want to say anything,
I was just going to add on to what Bill was talking about the wounds, and I think it's important to acknowledge that the resurrected Jesus continues to carry the wounds. So it's not just in Jesus' lifetime or in your lifetime, but it's sorry, I just stepped on my cat. But it's in the resurrection for all of eternity that God carries these wounds. And it's not just like the physical wounds, the whip, the nails, but the emotional, I've been betrayed, I've been abandoned, I'm left alone during this struggle. Like I have a hard time envisioning someone going through what Jesus did and not having PTSD. So like the resurrected Christ, that God for all eternity carries that wound as part of God's identity, and how that connects us for all of eternity, in this life and in the next. So that's it, I'm done.
If I may jump in briefly, I can't help but see a couple threads. There's a thread that runs through our church today and our conversations today, how to engage people about the choir system. And, you know, I can't help but feeling that the choir system was so successful because people who were wounded from years of war or suffering or persecution in Europe, or having to travel around the world, set up a new community, whatever their wounds were, I think they certainly have them. But we look back on the choir system as, you know, this kind of successful support system within our church. And I can't help but feel that it's this experience of shared vulnerability that Zinzendorf somehow nurtured and protected. He built a wall around it, a safe wall, where Moravian brothers and sisters could share their experiences. And that's what the church is supposed to be today. But I feel like that same sharing of vulnerabilities is what scares people away today as well. I appreciate you bringing up these points, because that, you know, that helps me to think, you know, maybe there's something to intentional sharing and intentional vulnerability within community. Zinzendorf, I think, has a lot to say about that.
Yeah, I like that connection to community a lot. And I wonder too, I think it'd be interesting to look at like the relationship between the success of the choir, like when the choir system was at its peak, and then the like how the blood and wounds factored into worship. Like were they at their peak when that style of worship was at a high point? It would be really an interesting historical question. Well, anybody, I'll give one more call. Any other comment or question before I'll kind of wrap up with sort of what's coming next. If there's we got anybody else who wants to share. All right. So yeah, this has been really great. I really appreciate the discussion. I really appreciate you all's willingness to hop in and talk. That's what makes this more exciting. So knowing that, and that's the kind of group we have, I'm going to talk less next time. I'm going to try to. I'm not going to make a whole lot of promises. But so next week, there'll be an email coming out with 3 more videos. We'll be talking about this, sort of moving these topics even farther along. And we'll be sort of going back with this a week from tomorrow. A week from today, we'll be back at the Zoom conversation like this. So I don't think there's any BCM announcements, anything y'all need to do before we wrap. Okay. Well,
Thank you so much.
Go ahead.
It's, you know, just putting in a plug for our website. If you have any questions about the materials that Chaz has referenced this evening, you'll find them by registering through the MoravianBCM.org website. And please be in touch if you have other questions. Please send us an email.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And I would love to hear how y'all, and if you want to, you know, find my email or contact me, I'd love to hear how you think this format is going, especially given, you know, COVID world. Everything we're trying is new, and would love any kind of feedback on how any of this is being received. So, because I'm sure we'll be trying more of this stuff in the future. So, all right. Well, everyone have a good night. Grace and peace, everybody.